want today's tutorial to be an extension of the last tutorial I posted, which we made these cool particle swirls with Cinema 4D's new particles. But just after I recorded that tutorial, 2025.1 came out, which kind of changes the structure a little bit of how we can make these particles, especially how we can render them in Octane. So I felt like it was worth my while making an extension of that tutorial, but also diving a little bit deeper in how we can art direct it more, make the particles with a little bit more purpose, and make cooler things in general with them. So today we're going to be doing it with this cool car logo, but what's cool about this is you can use any object that you want. So any ideas you've had in mind, I would really encourage you to bring those ideas to life with this. But I'm not really going to spend too much time going over the kind of Porsche logo that I'm using here. If you want that project file, you can go and get it over on my Patreon. And also these PS5 renders that I did with the particles swirling about the controller, there's going to be a tutorial for that up tomorrow on my Patreon. So what I'm going to do is for the first 5 people that hit that link at the top of the description after this tutorial goes live, will get my Patreon for free for the first month. But don't worry if you missed that, because for the first 2 hours after this tutorial happens to go live, there will be another link where you can use the code simulation and get my Patreon for 50% off for the first month. With all that being said, let's go make these renders. So we have our car logo here, pretty simple setup. I'll overlay a little bit of footage of me doing the similar thing with a Lamborghini logo. It's not too much of a difficult setup to make these. And they look quite good. But like I said, if you want this project file, then just hop over to my Patreon. We're really going to expand what we did last week. And after I made that tutorial, I felt like there was a lot more I could have done with that tutorial, which is why I wanted to make this one. So we're going to start off by dropping in a emitter. And this tutorial also only kind of comes to life because I've saw comments about how do we use colliders in these simulations, how do I get that to work? Other people saying, you know, do we have to use the cloner? And with the new version, you don't have to use the cloner anymore. So I was a little bit gutted about that because it is immensely slow compared to being able to drop a object tag on the particle group like you can with Redshift. And now with 2025.1, we can do that. So things are going to get a little bit speedier. And I also found it was still crashing a lot, but I found some more workarounds now. I spent a bit more time with these setups. So drop that emitter in the particle group and change it to a cube. Now, of course, like when I made these, there was a lot of experimentation, and now I kind of get to push you through this in a more linear state. So if we press F3 here, and the reason I'm explaining that is because if we make this cube much bigger on each axis, we want the particles coming out of a cube here, right? And the reason for that is because we kind of want some density in the particles. And I showed you this setup briefly in the last tutorial, but we want this density kind of coming around the logo. This can be much more important if you've got more complicated shapes. This was much more important when I did the renders with the PS5 controller. So it's more optimal to kind of go for this density here as opposed to emitting off of a plane or a flat surface or a rectangle or anything similar. So we kind of want this density, and we kind of want it sitting at, you know, a decent point. We don't want it covering the logo, but we don't want it too far down as well. And like I said, it's going to be a pretty similar setup. So what we can do is up this count for now to 100,000, and we'll change the frame amount to 150. And the first thing we're going to go straight for is going to be that follow spline. Now for now I'm going to drop in a circle, but we're not going to use that. And we're not going to use that for the final render, but I'm going to drop in a circle. Now if we just kind of put that circle around the logo, right? And we put these in the particle group. We drop this into the follow spline, change it to guide. And then what we're going to need to do as well is, now we're in this top view. Sorry, I was in a bit of a setup scene there. I don't really do stuff like that, so I'm going to delete this stuff out because I tend not to do that. It's because I was in the project file for the Porsche logo. So I'm going to delete everything out and we'll rebuild that. Which means I also have my perspective view. Instead of top, it was on perspective. We want that to be perspective later on when we're in Octane. So of course now your scene by default probably looks a bit more like this, and I do apologize for not making these first few steps as beginner friendly. If you want more beginner centric, if you look at the tutorials through this Christmas calendar that I've been doing, they've kind of started more beginner friendly and build their way up, and I do often try to set the standard towards the viewer as if you have never touched Cinema 4D before, and build up the same kind of patterns of workflow each time. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing for me to correct my scene there to make it look more like what yours probably does. So of course what we want to do is make that emitter much bigger. And you know, the the composition here depends on your object, depends what you're working with. But with this car logo, I found it looked a lot nicer when it was bigger, when the composition was bigger and the logo was smaller. So that, of course, then means that we need this box to be bigger. And I often find that a good point with that is to just kind of have it a little bit larger than where we want our camera. So a good value for this could be something like 2600 by 1600. And then we can sort of rest our camera in the middle there. And something like that probably works quite well. So you can see when we play through that now, not a lot happens. And that's because in the follow spline, we're going to want to bring up that effect radius. And if we zoom out here, pretty much until the entire cube follows along with us. And that's what's good about these new particles, is they're very responsive in the viewport, and you can afford to play through while making changes. And that's so useful. Falls apart a little bit with that later on when you're working with higher particle counts. But either way, for now, this works really good. Now let's add a couple more mandatory things to this simulation. So if you've watched my other particle tutorials, you're going to have seen that I kept adding this data mapper. Now, if you're new to particles, this is something that we're going to want to do in nearly every particle simulation, unless we're shooting the particles from frame 1, which is not what we're doing here. We're on a constant rate of emission, and that is going per second. So we're working with 100,000 particles every second. So every 30 frames, 100,000 particles are being spawned in across those 30 frames. If we were shooting in the particles from frame 1, and assuming we didn't want those particles to, fade out or anything, then we wouldn't really need this data mapper. We're going to rename this data mapper to radius by well, I won't do it in all caps because it's a bit aggressive. Radius by age. The data mapper, I said this in one of my earlier particle tutorials, it can seem a little bit scary, but it's great because there's many things we can do with it. But what we can especially leverage it for is the radius of the particles. So if you change the property out to radius, and we change this for now to 1, well, we'll change it to 0.2, and then we control with this spline. You can see we're going to want this at about 90 frames, and then holding control, you put in this dot here, and we can change these by selecting them all and changing them to soft. And I would maybe want them to hit their peak a little bit early on. That now on frame 0, they're going to have a size of 0, a radius of 0, and they're going to scale in, and then, around a halfway point, kind of hit 0.2, 0.2. That's the max radius they're going to hit, and then slowly fade out again. But what we have to do to get that to work correctly is go to properties, radius, and change that to 0. But that's not actually going to work until we go to the particle group, come up here to draw radius, select that, change the size to 0.001. Now we can see that these particles are scaling in. And this is going to become much more evident as we up the count. So let's up the count to 500,000. And now we can see what's going on a little bit more. So really right now all we're doing is building that same setup we had in the last tutorial. So let's add a turbulence. Let's set the scale to 6%. Let's set the strength to 15. We're going to make this one a bit more aggressive. And then we're going to duplicate that turbulence. We're going to set the scale to something like 12%. Keep the strength the same. Duplicate it again. Change the scale to something like 25%. Up the strength to 20. Duplicate it one more time. Up the scale to something like 60%. And up the strength to something like 30. So then we have this kind of gradient of turbulences starting really small and getting bigger. And if I turn all of these off by the smallest one, you can see the small one, it's not making much of a difference right now. And a lot of that will be, if we come to the follow spline, we have this thing called the mix. If you imagine this on 100%, it's only paying attention to the follow spline. You imagine this on 0%, it's only paying attention to everything else in the scene. So we kind of want this somewhere between, I want to say 15% and 50. Often kind of gets us the best results. This is flying in also way too quick. So we want to drop that attract strength way down to about 1.2. Around about 1, usually a value of 1. The align mix can, I believe I had a simulation where I saw this helping, but we'll leave it on 0 for now. So now we have that small turbulence. we add in the slightly bigger one, and you can see we get more detail. We add in the even bigger one, we're going to kind of get more waviness now. We add in the bigger one, and that's really going to break things up, and that brings together the simulation. The last thing we would need here is a color mapper. That's going to bring the entire simulation to life a little bit more. We set this to age. We match it to the radius lifespan, which would be 90 frames. So we match it there. And let's just delete out that blue one. Porsche colors, kind of orange, gold, red type color on this logo. And we can see them all spawning in there. And seeing this color just helps us. I'm going to turn off the work plane, which is that grid in the back. Seeing that color just sort of helps see what's going on with the simulation. And there's something here going on in frame 1. See this massive X? Hopefully you can see that. There's a gap in the particles. So we're going to want to problem solve that. I'm going to be led to believe it's due to the effect radius, and we're going to want to bring the effect radius up to something like 3,000 centimeters and see if that eliminates it. And it has not. So if we come to the emission, let's go to properties. Let's see if it's something to do with the speed here. So although this follow spline is in here and is adding a lot of force to the particles, because of this mix value, we're only using 35% of the force of the follow spline right now, which means we're still using some of the speed. If we set this velocity speed in the emitter to 0, that gets rid of it. So you can see there just a little bit of problem solving and thinking about what is going on with the different modifiers and stuff, and we can kind of get rid of problems easy enough. What I would actually be more inclined to do is, if we turn off this follow spline for a second, is to set this negative minus 100 and then set it to radial. And now the particles are kind of moving inwards on their own, and that can sort of just add to the follow spline. Something you can certainly do some stuff with. The emitter right now, I don't like how much it dies out on the edges, right? So, we zoom out here. I think I'd probably want that a little bit bigger. Maybe 3,000 by 2,000. And if we come back to that F3 view, the only thing to really think about with the density here, if we were to bring that down to about 100, is that there is kind of more room for particle wastage, because although we're spawning in a high amount of particles, they're kind of being wasted down in this depth here. And again, it really depends on what object you're using, but it's something to think about there, is we might potentially pull a little bit more detail by making that thinner. But if you're using a thicker or more complex object, you might need that extra thickness to kind of compensate for the particles hugging around the object, which is the effect we're going to go for. But anyway, without all my rambling and exposition around everything, let's group these turbulences up and put them in a group and call them turbulences. Now, when it comes to colliding against this object, a lot of people seem to have a couple of questions, because in the modifiers here, we need to add in this external tag, this external modifier called a collider. And a lot of people seem to think I thought of this. I remember figuring this out with an art director on a project just after the particles came out, and we were trying to figure out how to get the collider working. We couldn't figure out how to do it. And it was just like really odd kind of figuring it out. But thankfully, there's all these scenes in the asset browser. I do want to point this out because we're going to use this in some other tutorials, is that if you go to the asset browser, you go to example scenes, it's really buried down here. You go to features, you go all the way down to particles. There's all these scenes here. And these scenes here have really allowed me to create just about everything I've made tutorials on by studying these scenes. We ended up kind of figuring it out through something in there, I believe. But either way, we also need to add a collider to the object we want it to collide off of. And a lot of people seem to think that that's all you need to do. But unfortunately, you don't. You need to add this collider here as well. So a lot of the settings here, because for example, with X particles, if you were to add this make this an XP collider, a lot of the settings that are in here would be in the XP collider, and even then a lot of the settings that are here. So I don't quite understand why you have to do it, but the weird part about it is you have to change this mode to include and then drag in the collider tag from your object. Dragging in the object, oh, it does seem to work now. That wasn't working for me the other day. Now I'm not entirely sure which one it is, because I was dragging in the collider tag. What we'll do is try both and see what works. So with in the collide here, the Porsche logo mesh in there. Let's have a look at this. And we're getting collisions. Are we? We're not getting collisions. So let's try it the other way around. Let's drop in the tag instead. Now we're getting collisions. Let's have a little look at that. Yeah, so I was right. You have to put in the tag. And I would probably up this radius to 1 as well. I believe that's something I was doing. Yeah, so seems to work with the tag, not the object. The other day, I'm pretty positive it wasn't letting me actually drag the mesh in here. But we drag in that object. Let's make this circle a bit smaller. Come back to this view. And now they're definitely flowing around it. And this is what I liked as well, is them kind of flowing over the edges and flowing around it. And if we bring up that circle on the y-axis, so we raise it up above the logo, you're going to get more kind of curling over the edges of your object. And I really like that effect. But here's where we're going to take a bit of a pivot. Setup's looking good right now. Having a circle around it is really, really cool, and I like the results, but with a lot of objects this isn't going to work quite as well. Now with this follow spline, we're not attaching to the spline. We're not trying to get the spline to be a rail for our particles. We just want the particles to sort of move about in that direction, and in this instance as well, collide with our object. So no matter what object you have, you can pretty much just sort of outline it with a spline, right? Maybe want to not be too lazy with it, but something a little bit like this. Probably have to double click on that one. And this is also the method of how you would make the Porsche logo, really. Just drop the picture in the back and outline it like this. Now we could grab a selection of the logo and do an edge to spline, but the reason I'm showing you it like this is because if you have any kind of more complex object like a PS5 controller or anything that is not something as simple as basically a shield, I don't know why I can't grab that point, that's probably going to be a little bit more difficult to do, and I would say that doing this is the better way to go. Because like I said, we don't need the object. We don't need the particles to follow the object super accurately, and even here I'm probably putting in a bit too much effort, but I guess we all do that, don't we? Otherwise we wouldn't be very good artists. I want to say that'll do. I'll maybe just give it a bit more breathing room on each side here. And then with that spline, we'll put that in the follow spline instead. And now we're going to see the particles following the object more accurately to the shape of the object. We can turn off that circle for now. We can play with this spline a little bit. Let's make it a bit smaller. So they're really trying to bash into the Porsche logo, and then if we were to bring it up again to kind of get that bleeding over the edges, that's really the effect that we're going for here. And you know, that's building on last week's tutorial, that's building on what we did then, while expanding on it, allowing us to art direct it and really get a lot more results. Now, before we go any farther and we do any rendering in Octane or anything, I'm going to save my scene where it's at, and then I'm going to save it incrementally. And with the follow spline, the first thing I want to look at is the two values we looked at in the last tutorial as well. And that's the attract strength and the follow strength. Now, hopefully you're at the understanding, if you followed that tutorial, that the attract strength increases the amount of force that we're going to slam against that spline with. So of course we don't want too much of that, because we want to see our turbulences and see the kind of flow of the scene. The follow strength increases the rotation. Now, of course, we don't want too much of that either, so it's about balancing both of them. If we bring down the attract strength, but we make the follow strength something a little bit higher, what we can then get is enough attraction that the particles sort of pull in, but then we get this really kind of beautiful movement that's going to follow the shape of the object. So if you've got a PS5 controller or whatever object you've got, your logo, anything, you're going to see the kind of outlines of that object kind of moving around. So with the PS5 controller, you had this beautiful kind of shape, and then it was dipping up into the kind of ridges where the grips of the controller are, and then coming back around. And this is quite a simple object, so it's harder to see that, but, well, you can see it. I really like this effect. It's dropping down the attract strength and bringing up the follow strength. You can maybe bring up the fall off of both of them a little bit. And then let's do the reverse of that and kind of see, less follow strength, but more attract strength. And now what we get is this kind of curdling up on the logo that's almost like very turbulent, very flame-like. And I really like that as well. So you can kind of see the adverses there. It's a little bit more cool to see the different approaches we can take with these modifiers when we've got objects in the scene and we've got more space for art direction and more directions to take things. There is one part of the way this simulation looks, being the lines on the edges, that I really like. I'm going to show you a way that we can exemplify that. And you might not want a scene here where all the particles are filled in on the screen at once. You might want a scene where it's kind of more just structured around the logo within itself. So there's a couple of ways we can do that, and that means that we need different emitters. So the first one I'm going to show you is going to be we're going to do both of these with the spline emitter. I thought we were going to need two different emitters. We don't, we just need one, and that's going to be the spline emitter. So what we need to do with the spline emitter after we've dropped that in, it's going to drop in a new particle group. We don't want that particle group, so we're going to delete it. We're going to go to the spline emitter, and we're going to drag in our ordinary primary particle group. We're going to bring up this count to 500,000, and then go to properties. We'll set this to radial. We'll bring the speed to 0. We'll bring the radius to 0. And then, for example, let's take this circle from before. Let's enlarge it. And, let's go to the spline emitter, go to the emission, and drag in the circle. And now when we play through this, we're going to get the particles coming off the circle and flying towards the logo. Now, I went over this in a previous tutorial as well. The unfortunate part of this is we get a lot of weird kind of patterns from it emitting on the points of the circle. I had found ways around this without raising substeps, changing the interpolation and raising the emitter points, but for some reason that's not working now. Basically, to cut it short, you would do Control-E, go to Simulation, Particles, raise your substeps, and this would get rid of this, but then that would mean you have to change the values of your forces to kind of compensate for it. I'm not really going to go too much into that because I don't want to spend too much time on this setup, so I'm going to leave these in here for the most part. They can actually look cool sometimes as well. But the main reason I wanted to mention this is because if you were to then make the circle bigger than the composition like we did with the cube before and have them sort of blowing in here. Now let's up the count because this isn't quite enough. Let's go to 1,000,000. Now you can see we've got way too many of those ridges now, so we would probably want to up the substeps and see what that gets rid of. And you can see as you would up these more and more, it would get rid of them. But the main reason I'm exploring that and telling you about this is because for some reason when you use the spline emitter compared to the box emitter, bring back those substeps for the box emitter, those kind of lines, should you art direct that more, are going to be much more accentuated and kind of coming from the edges of the screen more. And I guess the reasoning for that would be because you're, emitting from a certain point and it's curling in on that follow spline and the turbulences, rather than what we're doing right now is emitting out of a volume and all the particles are kind of coming up at the same point, well, at random different points, and then kind of adapting to that motion as they go. So that would also then help for animation more, because if you were animating in from the edges, you could have more of a slamming into the screen. But I didn't want to use the spline emitter to really show you that. I wanted to use it to show you something else. And that would be to take the spline, if we call this logo spline, it would be to take the spline we used for the follow spline and just emit off the same spline and then see what happens. is we then get all these particles spawning around the logo. And if we go to the follow spline and we increase the follow strength, and increase the attract strength a little bit, we can then have the particles flowing around the logo. So then if we were to drop that below the logo and play through that, you get all these particles flowing around the logo, which can also be a really cool render that some of you might like. And this would look even cooler if you were to change the emission to range and have it only emit for about 30 frames. You would then have them emit, and after 30 frames, then you've just got a set amount of particles and they're flowing around. You would probably want to up the lifespan here to 150, and then you get them all sort of flowing around there. So there's some really cool stuff to do there as well. And, you know, I would probably up the mix a little bit, up the attract, up the follow strength, and you can get this. That doesn't look too cool. Maybe drop that down, drop the attract. But you can get this really cool effect of them flowing around. We want the attract a bit higher. I think you get the point, really. But that is the main thing I wanted to show you there, because I thought that setup, that's more like it. I thought that setup was really, really cool. And I did that in a couple of renders. But more to come with that on the Patreon tutorial. What we're going to do now is go back to that first setup. So we're going to save this incrementally again. Now, rather than going back to the other scene file, I am just going to reverse you back to that setup. So what I'm actually going to do is delete the spline emitter and turn back on the basic emitter. And in the follow spline, now I'm just going to kind of push this more towards what I want us to do for the rest of the tutorial, which would be the attract strength and the follow strength kind of being around similar values and having them all kind of curl in here. And we want a bit of that rotation around everything, but I really want the meat of everything to be around the object here in the middle, where it is really puffy and thick around the middle of the object. Now with that simulation setup, what we can do is move to Octane. Okay, so now we're going to get into doing some rendering in Octane. So we're going to boot up this live viewer, and this is really where I feel like this tutorial was important to make, is there is some cool things I'm excited to show you here. And the first being with the release of Cinema 4D 2025.1 is now we don't have to use the cloner and put the particle group in the cloner. We can just put in a Octane object tag on the particle group and render particles the way we're used to rendering them, which is super useful. There is one little thing that I found is acting up with it, which I do want to go over. I mean, it is kind of acting up, but it's not at the same time. And if we drop in a cube here, right? And if I just zoom out a whole bunch, just before we get Octane going, let's shove that cube off to the side. And let's drop in a Octane camera, come back to our main view. We'll change this to perspective just because I dropped it in while I was in the other view. And then change it to 135. Zero this out. Zero the Y out. Change the P rotation to -90. And then we can zoom out a bunch and come up to a decent distance. And if I drop this cube, change this to geometry, and I drop this cube in here, set off the render, you're going to see something interesting. And well, what you're seeing is what you would expect the particles to be rendering because we put the cube in there. But here's the strange thing. The cube's at 200 centimeters, is at default size. I've been running this at about 100. A lot of this is due to the data mapper being on such a small value of 0.2. I am going to keep this at 0.2 because when it comes to art directing in the viewport, changing turbulences, changing different modifiers, and art directing the actual simulation, I feel like this is a good point to be at, and I don't want to keep changing it back and forward. So I find it a little bit easier to just adapt to whatever these sizes need to be. And I did have to experiment with that because I would usually have these at like 0.51, and I had to keep upping it to kind of see what's the normal size. So I guess that is a little bit weird there that the sizes are so off. I'm not quite sure why that is, but I think about a size of 100 is going to be good for what we're doing today. But what I actually want to do is come to frame 0. And the reason for that is because when we're rendering particles and we're rendering an object, no matter what object you're going to be using, we're going to want to light the object and the particles separate from one another. And this is going to be pretty much vital, I want to say, for nearly any object that you're using to achieve a good result. So let's drop in a texture environment and let's make it black. And then what we're going to do is we're going to drop in a Octane area light. We're going to target the Porsche logo, and I'm going to press F2 and then come to perspective. And then with this, I'm going to kind of light from the top and the side, but what I'm actually going to do, because this material is highly reflective, I am going to go to C4D Octane and add a fall off map and set the power to about 1000. And that's going to mean that the light has to be much closer, but the reflections are going to look way nicer. And I'm going to put a couple of different lights here around the Porsche logo. Maybe one at each side and one at the bottom. And this is going to vary for whatever kind of object you're using. Again, look out for the PS5 controller tutorial that's going to go up on my Patreon, because the lighting for that is probably going to be similar to the kind of objects most people will be using. So we've got some lights there. What we can do is highlight those tags and turn off the camera visibility, turn off the shadow visibility, go to light settings, and turn down the opacity. So now what these lights are going to be are Porsche lights, object lights, whatever you want to call them. They're going to be the lights that are going to light our object. So we're going to leave that light ID on 1. But then what we're going to do before we, if you remember from the other tutorials, we were duplicating the cubes to then kind of create a little bit of variation in different sizes in the cubes. But before we do any of those duplications, we're going to put a C4D Octane object tag on that cube. And then all we're going to do there is go to Object Layer, enable the Light Pass Mask, and we're going to disable Light 1. And then what we're going to do is go to the Porsche logo, and you can see it already done that from a previous scene, is we're going to disable Light 2. Because then when we group these lights, and we call this Object underscore lights, and then we drop in a new area light and we set this to a light pass of 2. And for example, we do similar lighting to what we did in the other tutorials. Be sure to watch those. And we add a target, and we can just target our object again and just kind of have the light come to our side view here, sat above the particles and stuff, kind of like this. And we can put in a second one shortly as well. But now what this setup is going to make occur is that we've got lights for the object and lights for the particles. And this means that we can get nice reflections on the object, we can get highlights where we want highlights, without that causing sudden bursts of light across the particles and making it look strange. But when you do this, you want to make sure that the lights look coherent with one another. You still want to make sure that the light doesn't look too separate from the rest of your scene. So what we can do now, and this is another thing I want to go over, which again adds, I feel like, to the vitality of me making this second part to this tutorial, is that when I play through this here, and I'm probably going to have to up the count now, so let's come to 1,000,000 particles, just while we're rendering. 1,000,000 is still quite a modest amount, I feel like, and we come up to about 90 frames. I was experiencing a lot of crashes, especially on higher particle counts, even when I was cached on particle counts similar to this. I was experiencing a lot of crashes when I would play through the simulation here, pause, and then I want to look at the particles, so I'd come up here and hit render, and that was causing crashes. I'm just going to save here. The way that I found was the best way around this was to just stop and reset the render data every single time. So if you're going to play through the simulation here, let's say you make any changes at all, I would then restart it and then hit the render button again, rather than just going from pause to render. And I was finding that was stopping me crashing a lot. So that's an important tip, and that was helping me out a whole bunch. So as you can see here now, we've got this light on the top of the particles, and then we've got the object being lit separately. What I'm going to do in the Octane camera is turn on ACES tone mapping just for now, and I'm going to drop that exposure a little bit, and I'm going to change my aspect ratio to 16:9. Next up, I'm going to add a universal material. And then what we need to do now to get the color to show is, rather than what we would have done in the last tutorial where we dragged in the instance color because we were using the cloner, is now what we need to do is pressing tab, look for something called the MoGraph color shader. And if we drop that in the albedo now, that will just directly pull the necessary color data from the color mapper. What we need to do is put that material on the cube, and our color shows, and we're going to make a couple of changes. We're going to put up the roughness, we're going to bring up the metallicness a bit, and drop the specular a bit. And then what we're going to do is, I'm actually finding the size of these cubes a bit too big. Rather than changing the size, the scenes I've been working on have been used to using a size of 100. So I'm going to change this here to 0.1, and hopefully that should be similar to what I've been using. And that's definitely looking a little bit better. What we want to do though is we want a little bit of variation in the particles. We've been over that. So we're going to duplicate the cube a whole bunch of times, maybe duplicate it 4 times and then duplicate them again. And then on the top one, call it big. And then set this to about double the size. So set it to about 200. And then if we come to that particle group tag and go to the particle rendering, what we want to do is just drag in all those other cubes. You'll have to reselect it there. Drag in all those other cubes. And the reason we're adding so many is because then that's going to offset the amount of big ones. So we're not going to get as many of those big ones, which is going to make it feel a little bit nicer. We should probably also change our render settings for now. So I would come down to about 512 samples, put your depth at 8, and come down to GI clamp and set that to 10. Now, like I said, this tutorial has really been about expanding on the last tutorial. So we're not really far away from the finish line here. What I want to do is implement some different colors into this Porsche logo. So what we can do is just put a gradient in the middle here, and now we can kind of pull whatever colors we want. So I was messing with blue ones, I was messing with orange ones, black ones, I was doing all different types. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to do something similar to what we've got, like an orange into some sort of red. But we can also do different color combinations here. You can just duplicate it, plug that into your albedo. We could do a blue into a white, and you can clamp this and change this to get more of the kind of color you want. So you could have that blue kind of tighter, or you could have it fade more. And another thing I actually did with the Porsche logo inside my material here, and this is just me, I love Porsches, right? Dream car, GT3 RS, same for a lot of people, total car guy. And you know, when you see those kind of, I forgot what version of a Porsche it is, but there's a specific Porsche out there. You know, if you get like a BMW M4, and you can get like a BMW M4 comp, but then you can get like a CS version. I swear there's a version like that for like the GT3 or something. If somebody's at this point in the tutorial and you know what it is, please comment what it is. But there's a version that comes with like a black logo, or like a dark kind of grayed out logo. So I wanted to make a version of that as well, which I was doing because I thought that looked really, really cool. So I did a couple of those. I really can't remember what it's called. I don't think it's like a GT version. You know, you'll get like or you'll get like an Audi R8 GT. It's like that kind of equivalent, like CS, GT, something. I swear it's something like that. But anyway, if you're a Porsche fanboy like me, then I'm sure you'll recognize this. Is it Brabus or something? Is there like a Brabus version of the 911? I'm not going to go into cars right now. We need to make renders. The last couple of things I'm going to really work on here is the lighting. I'm going to add a bit of vignetting there. And we'll come back to the camera, but we're going to mess with the lights a little bit. So in those object lights, I'm going to try and increase the brightness a bit. I'm going to make sure I save that so it doesn't crash. I've experienced one crash recording this tutorial. In fact, I don't think it was a crash. It was the first time I tried to drop in the material, and it just took about 2 minutes, and I got bored and just killed the software with Task Manager. So yeah, I just want a little bit more light on the object here. So I'm just going to bring these up and around, see if I can get a bit more light on the logo. That's the weird thing about the fall-off maps as well, is like you have to put the lights at really funky angles. So like I was saying, I'd really only suggest the fall-off maps if you're using a metallic reflective object like this. Yeah, so that's a little bit more like it, just so the logo's popping a little bit more. And then if we press F3, the last thing we could probably do is pop another light on the other side of the particles, but I'd make this one a little bit farther away and drop it down a little bit more. Although I do like all that light kind of coming from one direction. Quite a big fan of that, but I think it's just a little bit of light coming from the bottom. And then I'm going to set up the camera, so I'm going to drop in my LUT. You would have seen this in other tutorials. I believe the link to these LUTs is in my Prime tutorial, just to point that out as I've had a few comments. So then I would have to turn off Faces tone mapping, bring up the highlight compression, and then bring down the exposure probably, bring down the gamma, get a bit of contrast in there. And then I'm going to overcompensate with the saturation a bit, bring up the vignetting a bit, and then give it a tiny bit of bloom. And also, if I zoom in here, there's a little bit of yellow, and that's because I had this material, this metallic material on this side of the Porsche logo. Again, this is dependent on what object you're using. You might be using a car logo, you might not, I don't know. But I made that gold, and because I've made it black and white now, I would probably want to, take the color out of the specular there, just so that gold refraction isn't bouncing on the particles. There's not much left to do here. This is pretty much the render, but there's a lot to play with. So where I would really take it from here is if you're gonna, at least on my machine, anything above 1 million particles, and the live viewer was getting pretty unresponsive. So if you're gonna go above 1 million particles, I would suggest probably caching before you do any work in the render, which really elongates the process of playing with the render, because if you want to make little changes, you kind of need to cache it. And then if you cache, for example, 3 million particles, that can actually change the way the color mapper maps itself to the particles, because there's so many more of them. But for a final render, I would probably be going for more particles than this. What I want to do just before I send you on your way is just see some sort of other result. So let's try with a little bit of a lower attract strength and a little bit of a lower follow mix on the follow spline. And I also want to see inside the turbulences, if we drop in another one, if we can get an even larger scale on a higher strength. See if we can get, that could be way too much. Let's maybe put up that mix a little bit again, just so it's not getting too flaily. Yeah, something like that. And then I want to see more particles over the edges of the logo. So we're using that logo spline. Do what I did before and bring it up and then make it a bit smaller. Just so it's kind of sitting indented into the logo there. See if that helps. Yeah, cool. Yeah, so I want a bit more of that. And I think I'm happy with this. So like I said, let's restart the render, then send the render off. It's a little bit over the top, I want to say, but I want to say pushing more in the right direction of the way I would want the render to look. So we'll push it a little bit farther. We'll bring up that attract strength a bit more and the follow strength a bit more. And we'll bring up the mix a tad bit as well. And this was another issue I kept facing as well, where when I would pause Octane, it would then, the viewport would sort of lag a little bit into the simulation. I'm pretty sure that's just because we're running the simulation off the GPU here. So I would kind of be under the assumption that as the GPU is kind of stressed out a little bit with Octane, the moment you switch back to trying to play through the simulation, that it then starts bugging out a little bit. So we can play through that and see if there's any changes, assuming it doesn't lag, which it is. But usually you'll find you'll get 30 frames in or something, and then it sort of speeds itself up a little bit again. But I only really found this issue coming off of render, and sometimes I would just keep restarting it until it behaves itself, because there's nothing we've done here. This should make it lag, and this is where I'm finding kind of inconsistencies with the particles at the minute, is it just sort of randomly gets really slow out of nowhere, and it's a bit jarring and difficult to work with at times. So we can have a little look at that. Let's restart the render, and then we'll send that render off again. Hopefully it doesn't take too long. It seems to be slowing down a bit now, and it's crashed even though I restarted it, so I'll have to reboot that. Okay, so back in the software now, we can play through it again. And this is the thing as well, right? You just saw it kind of lagging and jittering its way along. And then it crashed right after it. And I kind of think that sometimes that can indicate that a crash is coming, and then sometimes you just kind of need to give the software a restart and it keeps going, and that is irritating and difficult to work with. But at least you can kind of find solid workarounds, and hopefully they manage to even that stuff out in time. And this looks quite cool. I think my only grievance with the render right now would be the fact that the particles are moving so quickly. We're requiring more substeps, but I don't really want to increase the substeps, so I'm just going to decrease that mix value a bit and decrease the follow strength a little bit, as this is just the method I used before. I wasn't really having to lean into substeps in my initial renders, and even on a few million particles I don't think I even brought them up. As you can see now, we're hitting that. That was the example I meant before, where it lagged a bit and then sped up. I think something like this should hopefully look good. I think the last thing we need to probably change is the radius by age. So I think what's happening is the particles aren't fading off quick enough. And typically I had them fading off around 90 frames to 120 frames. And I think what's happening is they're retaining too much thickness around the top point here. And that's making them look a little bit too stuck together. I often like it more when particles are a bit more aired out, and when they look a little bit softer and smaller. I think to me it just looks more elusive as opposed to something that looks more kind of connected together. Now this is taking a while to render, so there could be another crash coming. Yeah, I feel like for the most part I'm probably going to leave this tutorial here. I really just kind of wanted to go over a couple of new things and show you guys how we can implement objects and art direct this into a bit of a stronger direction. There is things I want to keep changing because I still feel like there's, I can lay this all out for you. I can get you to this kind of point. I can get you this render. Then I could just play with it for hours and hours and hours, and I don't want the tutorial to be overly stretched out. I feel like I've kind of hit most of the beats here, and if I continue to just start playing with it endlessly, it's going to the structure of the tutorial is going to fall apart, which is why I want to start doing live streams, is so I can just play with things and you guys can observe that. But realistically, should I start playing with it endlessly, the tutorial would lose a lot of its flow. I wasn't going to cache anything, but I want to show you guys within the tutorial what this would look like on the higher amount of particles, because I feel like that is important to show. So what I'm going to do here is cache the scene on 2.5 million particles. And I will just ramble for a little bit while the tutorial closes up and I cache this. Much more tutorials to come the rest of the month. I do apologize for not making any tutorials up on my Christmas calendar the last week. I had some personal issues which unfortunately got in the way. I'm still going to do as many as I can the rest of the month. I've still got plenty of tutorials lined up, and I can't wait to release them all. I'm really enjoying making all these tutorials this month, so it ached me a lot to not be able to do any the past 4 or 5 days or so, and I can't wait to keep uploading them. I've really appreciated all the feedback, the questions. It's really allowed me to keep plugging things back into the tutorials and then kind of help you guys directly, because you guys have questions and you want to know how to do certain things, and then being able to loop that back around into a video is super useful. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, if you're one of the first 5 people that hits that link in the description when the tutorial goes up, you'll get my Patreon for free for a month. But for 2 hours after the tutorial goes live, I might even just leave this for the end of the tutorial, because not many people are going to get this far as soon as the tutorial comes out. But I'm probably going to leave the 50% discount up for basically the entire night, for the next 10-12 hours or so, just to see if anybody leans that far and sees that. If you had any ideas for tutorials you do want to see, please let me know, because I will most likely do them, especially if it's a good idea. I get a lot of people asking me to do beginners tutorials or like a beginner's guide, and I go on and off that because so many reasons, really. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of here's the basics of Cinema 4D out there, but I also believe that the best way to learn something isn't to understand this button does this button does that. I feel like that's a big flaw in terms of translating knowledge. I feel like the best way to learn something is to have your mindset on an idea, something you want to do, and then try to teach yourself to do that thing. And I feel like you're going to learn much quicker if you just find a tutorial and think, that's cool. I want to learn how to make that, and then go out your way to make that. There's something about the beginner's tutorials where I'm just sort of like, you know, this is a cube, this is polygons, this is a parametric object, this is a light. You just do all these things. I don't know how much of a fan I am of that, and I think I would much rather, and there's also a lot of that out there, you know, what can I do differently towards that? I'm sure there is things, I'm sure I could make it unique. I might end up doing it at some point, but for the most part, I feel like I've learned so well by thinking, you know, I want to make particles, or I want to make a render of this or that, and then just trying to discover that idea, and then learning things along the way. I've heard people say that about things like learning coding and stuff as well. It's like, if you want to learn how to code, think of something you want to code, and then figure that out, and you'll learn much quicker than if you're just to learn lines of code, basically, you know. But anyway, that's a lot of rambling. This is the render with around 2.5 million particles. I'm not entirely sure why the substeps are showing up so much, or these like little lines. I didn't have that on my initial render. It could be the size of the cubes. It could be because I didn't put in a spin modifier. I want to say it's most likely more the spin modifier. But either way, I actually kind of like the little lines on them. I feel like to an extent it looks cool, but there's a piece of your ego inside you that's kind of like, well, I know that that's a flaw in the way I've made the simulation, so I'm not entirely sure about that. I'm pretty sure if we brought down the size, it would get rid of them. What I would do if I've got a feeling it's most likely the spin modifier, because I was on the same amount of substeps, so I would put in a spin and put the speed up to like a fairly decent amount, and I think that would probably get rid of most of it. But I'm going to leave you here. Hopefully this was a bit more of an indicator on how we can take the swirls we did last week and just level them up, art direct them, make something that's branded out of them, make something that's got some real direction to it. And if you want to go and watch the tutorial that's going to be on my Patreon doing this with a PS5 controller, that one's much more finicky. I'm going to go back and forth a lot with that and make some animations with it. So if you're really interested in that, follow those links in the description, come over to the Patreon, see the tutorials over there, and we're going to take this whole idea and just expand on it with different objects. And if you want these project files with the Porsche logo, I'm also going to put the project files up that I actually used during this recording as well, so you guys can mess with that. Then go over there, grab that. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you tomorrow for another tutorial. Much more cool ideas on the way. Appreciate you as always, and goodbye. My Patreon is a place where I can make tutorials that are a lot more in-depth than YouTube, things that don't always suit the YouTube algorithm, breaking down all the different parts of my workflow, how I light things, how I apply materials to things, and the various different parts of my workflow, looking at client work, looking at breakdowns, looking at my scenes in general, and often doing a lot of repetitive tutorials over and over to really build up that workflow so we can get good at 3D. So sign up to my Patreon today and see exactly what my true 3D workflow is all about.